Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery preparing to check in on a couple of my buddy bins. As you can see, some of the buddy bins are quite obvious because they're stacked up on each other. Usually they're more than buddy bins. Those are usually like sister bins, brother bins, maybe even twin bins because they share the same origination date. But in the case of the buddy bins that we're checking in on today, they have quite a gap in between their ages. There's actually 60 days difference in their ages. And it wasn't even that long ago that we buddied them up. It was only 40 days ago that we buddied them up. And one of the bins was 60 days when it was buddied up. The other one was 120 days of age. So if you do some quick math, yep, you're right. One of the bins, the younger one, has now reached its 100 days in service. So it's kind of like a interesting milestone, nice round number. The older bin is now 160, so that 60 days in their ages can be seen right there. There's a couple little stats about them I thought I'd share with you before we get to feeding them. The older of the two bins, the 160-day-old system, was fed 14 times so far. The younger one, the 100-day-old one, fed 8 times. So they're getting feedings number 9 and 15 today. I've got an assortment of yummy foods to give them. A couple other things. There was, like I mentioned earlier, 40 days ago that we buddied them up, so we've been checking in on them a few times. And the last feeding was only 7 days ago. I've been gradually shortening the period of time between feedings. For a while there, I was going 10 days between feedings. Prior to that, it seemed like 12 days was the standard interval between feedings. But I've got a couple systems that are foraging. I've got a time-lapse running in another system. I'm kind of migrating worms in another. So I'm running out of material. I've got to tighten up the interval and return to feeding systems that I probably would have otherwise waited for a while. So we're going to get these systems up on the bench and we're going to get them fed. So let's get to work. The assortment of foods that I've got for these little guys today can be seen here in this tray. It's apple. There's some grape and strawberry, but the bulk of what they're getting is potato peel. And before I forget, there was also one last tidbit of information on the information board that was not mentioned. I just sort of glossed past it. But since we're on that topic now, I thought I'd really quickly recap what you might have read there, which was a reference to the top coverings of these systems being synchronized during the last check-in. When we first buddied these systems up 40 days ago, we didn't pay a great deal of attention to trying to lock them into being 100% consistent, at that point in time. We figured, one of the bins had paper-only coverings. I think it was a combination of paper and cardboard, and then the other system had plastic coverings. So we just figured, we'll buddy them up, but we're not going to force ourselves into some sort of a compulsive behavior of needing to sync them up from every aspect until it made sense to do so. I mean, you're running buddy bins, it makes sense for them to be synced up to some point. But I didn't want to force anything, so okay, there it is. I really wanted it to just let it ride, however it was that they were being covered at that time. And then we even, I think it was in these bins that we might have even swapped the dissimilar covers for each other when it seemed like the plastic covering would benefit the system that was a little bit dry, to not let it further evaporate and dry anymore. And then similarly, we kind of thought that it might be nice to let the system that was a little bit more damp kind of let off some of its moisture content, so it got the paper only covering. So that was kind of fortuitous at that point in time. But last check-in we did figure, you know what, let's go ahead and let's go get ourselves another plastic cover, and at the last check-in was our opportunity to sort of synchronize what was going on in the two systems and get them harmonized from a top covering perspective. At first, when I saw this piece of the corn cob jutting out of the surface, it didn't seem like too many worms were too interested in it quite yet, but the portion of it that was down a little bit lower seems like it was gaining the attention of the worms. And for that matter, it looks like we've even got a little bit of a worm party, kind of enjoying the collections of juices down there underneath the corn cob. So let's take a quick look at these little guys squirm. Interestingly enough, they somehow managed to remain on my glove for the most part, maybe with the exception of a couple worms that drop off in the very beginning, but most of them get the sense that they're sort of on something that they don't want to accidentally crawl off of and fall to who knows where, so they seem to stay put on my glove without falling off. So that's kind of an interesting thing I started noticing over one of my recent check-ins when we were doing these sort of close-up views of the worms squirming. Uh-oh. Does look like one of the little guys that did accidentally slip off my hand. Ended up right here in the gap between the two systems. So let's not let this little guy end up down on my very dry paper tablecloth, because that would not be a good thing for the worm to be on. Whole bunch of other worms hanging out down here. Perhaps they too were enjoying the corn cob juices. Looks like a lot of this paper, not paper, leaves. A lot of this leafy bedding that we placed down into the feeding area looks like it's still quite dry. I just unearthed a little bit of it and I saw like a little cloud of dust sort of leave it. Huh. Okay. Nevertheless, they're right on top of it, hanging out, enjoying the remains of the last feeding. And I think that the stuff that they got last time was going to be stuff that we'd probably see very little leftovers of, with the exception of some bits of it that we know do usually take a little bit more time. More specifically, obviously the corn cobs. We know those are going to take a long time every time. But here was the outer skin of the cantaloupe melon that they got last time, which I could have easily predicted would still be here as leftovers. Even though the juicy melon would have been nibbled off, the cantaloupe melon rinds are a somewhat tougher substance that the worms do seem to have a little bit more trouble working down. I mean, they'll eat everything, but it'll take them a little bit of time to work through that tougher outer skin of the melon. And man, we got a good bit of leftover bedding from the last time. And I've got replacement top coverings, some interesting pieces of paper here. It's the bag that you buy sugar in. It's like a double bag. If you buy sugar in this sort of a container, most people buy sugar in a paper bag like this. So there is like a double bag setup going on there. So I figured let's cut that double bag in half and use that as our top coverings. And then I thought that the old top coverings could come in here as supplementary bedding, I guess, going in here hand in hand with the leftover leaves from last time. So now, similar to what we just saw in the other bin, this system also received a corn cob which still had the kernels on it. And then we'll find another corn cob that was just the cob without any kernels on it in the other one, like we saw in the younger bin. So the older bin is the one right here. The younger bin is the one over there. But they were both fed very similarly last time, including each getting a piece of corn cob with the kernels on it and a corn cob without the kernels on it. Well, it seems like the worms are having a tougher time hanging on in this case than we saw previously. It's interesting because in this case, these couple of worms that landed right here in the middle, they seem to have the wherewithal to head towards the inside of the bin rather than towards the gap in between them. even though there wasn't a whole lot of gap in between them. On the previous occasion, it did seem like that one worm was trying to cruise in between the two bins to a not so safe spot. So you can tell right away the maturity level of the material in this system is so much further along. And I guess the other interesting thing I'm noticing right off the bat is that we probably did apply a similar amount of leafy material as bedding to both systems. I might just be misremembering or something, but it does seem to me like if that was true during the last check-in, the worms have really done a number on the leafy material that had been in here. But maybe I'm just not remembering correctly. Maybe there was just more leafy material placed into the other system for whatever reason. So I don't really recall the details offhand, but that might explain why we're seeing much less of that stuff down in this system over here in the older bin. So whatever, doesn't matter so much. Perhaps the thinking was that this stuff was perhaps a little bit more damp and putting in dry stuff would be helpful, and then maybe it was also the fact that, I don't know, I don't want to refer to it as the fact that, but maybe we can speculate that maybe this system seemed like it had a little bit more room for growth versus the other one. I can't remember the exact rationale as to why we have so many leaves over here and we don't have as many in the older one, but it's not that interesting. I don't think we need to pursue the topic a whole lot further. I think we are in a position to start into the feeding, giving them their portion. And we're going to bring in those top coverings that we had on here, since we've got replacements for them. And I've even got a replacement for the really demolished feeding zone indicator that had been over here. So we'll just put this to good use and put a nice new one in its place. And by putting it to good use, I'm just referring to the fact that it's turning into supplemental bedding down in the feeding zone underneath the food, which is the same thing that we're doing with the top covering newspapers that we removed. Some of the bedding that went in under the last feeding was napkins, and I think that's what we're finding leftovers over here. This is most likely bits of leftover napkin from the last feeding, as is this right over here. So we can get those bits of stuff back down into the feeding zone, as is the same to do with the leftover foods that we encountered along the way. And then we can come in with the nice new portion of food for them. As far as all this bedding over here, I'm kind of liking the idea of maybe just blending that stuff in throughout the material. As we get to covering up the feeding, we'll be able to stir things around a little bit more and sort of incorporate that stuff throughout the system into the material at large. And I think that'll help just in general with providing the entire system with a nice little boost to the bedding. Not so isolated down the feeding zone anymore, but more spread out throughout the whole system. So the potato, all this stuff, the grapes, everything is stuff that my mom contributed yesterday. I popped in over there yesterday after going to the post office and getting my car inspected. What did I go after? I think I went to the inspection station and the post office after my visit to my mom's, because she lives over there near the those two facilities. And she was good enough to provide some yummy stuff for the worms. Stuff that went into the freezer yesterday and has since frozen. And I would not be putting potato peels into my worm bins if it was not frozen first. Because anytime I've ever done that in the past, the stuff just sort of sits there, almost as if it's never going to break down. It eventually does, obviously, as does everything, but sometimes the stuff even wants to grow. So one thing that I definitely like to do is just make sure that the potato peels I put into my worm bins as food get frozen first. And then the stuff breaks down quite nicely and quickly. Whereas if you don't freeze it, you can expect to see that stuff sitting around as leftovers and maybe even trying to grow for a while. So that was kind of nice. Here's some corn cob that had been in here for some time, and we actually started busting it up into smaller chunks, which has kind of turned into my new thing to do with corn cobs. But I think the ones that we added last week, obviously the one that still has all the kernels on it, those are definitely not ready yet to be broken up into little fragments, but once they do soften up and become brittle enough to do that too, I will eventually get to breaking them up just like we have here too. Corn cob breaks up quite easily after it's been in the worm bin for a while. Quite different from the way it is when you first eat the kernels off of it, and then you got this corn cob, and it's a pretty tough fibrous material. Okay, so we've tilled up and stirred the edge of the bins that's furthest from me. Let's proceed to doing the same to the edge of the bins that's closer to me, and then we'll be more or less finished and ready to get these systems covered up and put back up on the shelf. So here in the older bin, you can quite clearly see a pretty good, concentration of castings piling up relative to all the other stuff in the bin, like leftover bits of bedding and food scraps or whatever. So those 60 days are clearly visible here. And here, the younger bin, the one that's now 100 days old, happy birthday, still has ways to go as far as catching up on that aspect, but it too is starting to pile up its collection of castings quite nicely, so certainly can't complain. So I think we've accomplished what I had hoped to do, which was to blend in some of that leafy matter into the material throughout the bin, not leaving any clumps of dry leafy material anywhere, sort of trying to get it all mixed in with some of the more damp material around it, which will help it get damp and enable it to get put to use by the worms versus just sitting there in a dusty pile of material that the worms are simply unable to get into. So I think that'll help it a lot. Over here, we must not have put any in, or if we did, it just got eaten up for whatever reason very rapidly. I don't exactly know why we didn't see any over here. Chances are we simply didn't put any in. So like I mentioned earlier, I've got this extra coffee filter sitting here, which is going to come in as the replacement coffee filter. And as we do sometimes, we're going to be coming in with our nice new replacement top coverings. These are double sheets of paper with a piece of paper bag on the bottom and a piece of just bleached white paper on top, formed into a nice tough sturdy container into which you can put a pretty heavy payload. And it's a good thing because, a little bag of sugar like this, 4 pounds, it's only this big. So the paper bag in which that stuff is stored has got to be pretty strong so as to not break due to a simple little mishap such as dropping it or something like that. So there we go. As usual, I forgot something that I had hoped to do. I had put my supply of grit over here, thinking that we might include that with the feeding today, but I forgot. No surprise with that. All right, everyone, that's it for the video. We're not going to try to make up for that. Perhaps next time they'll get some grit with their feeding. So hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. If you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.